Why do the shadows whisper what I cannot say? The air went cold the moment the first whisper breached the silence, not from a person, but from the deepening corner of my living room. I remember gripping the armrest, my breath catching, because even then I knew these weren't just shadows. They were the echoes of unspoken things I'd buried so deep they'd found another way out. This occurred around my late 20s, a time I had meticulously crafted into a fortress of predictable routines and quiet nights. I remember those long evenings in my apartment, the only sounds the distant sigh of city traffic and the contented hum of my refrigerator. My days, a relentless parade of client deadlines as a graphic designer, would dissolve into hours spent curled on my worn sofa, finding solace in the sheer absence of demands. It was a mundane existence, perhaps, but one I had come to depend on, a steady anchor in a world that often felt too chaotic. I thought then that I was simply tired, that the faint pressure beginning to throb behind my ears was just another symptom of late nights staring at a glowing screen. The initial manifestation was so subtle, so easily dismissed that I almost convinced myself it was a trick of memory, a retrospective imposition of dread onto an innocent past. It began as an almost imperceptible shift in the air when I was alone, a thinning of the usual stillness, like a breath being held just outside my range of perception. The silence, once a comfort, started to feel less like peace and more like a vacuum, waiting to be filled by something unknown. Then came the whispers. They weren't words, not in any language I recognized, but an impression of sound, a phantom chorus at the very edge of hearing, like dry leaves skittering across pavement or a sigh caught on a sudden gust. They seemed to emanate from the shadowed corners of my peripheral vision, a vague, shifting presence that never solidified, never quite resolved into a definite shape or source. Weeks blurred into a disquieting progression, the sensation intensified, the whispers growing more insistent, a constant undercurrent beneath the surface of my consciousness. I'd be sketching out a new logo, the rhythmic scratch of my pencil against paper a familiar comfort, when the faint pressure behind my ears would sharpen into a dull ache, accompanied by that unsettling suggestion of murmuring voices. It felt like something was being said, but eternally just out of reach, a secret being shared that I was forbidden to comprehend. I started leaving lights on even during the day, a futile attempt to push back the encroaching shadows that seemed to pulse with this unheard cadence. Sleep became a fractured landscape of half-dreams and jolting awakenings, each instance marked by the sensation of something having just retreated from the foot of my bed. One evening, as I watched the city lights ignite outside my window, a profound weariness settled over me. It was more than physical exhaustion. It was the fatigue of a mind constantly straining against an unseen boundary. The whispers, still formless, had coalesced into a distinct low thrum, a resonant vibration that seemed to originate not from outside, but from within the very fabric of the apartment, perhaps even from within me. It felt like a memory I couldn't quite grasp, a truth pressing against the walls of my own mind. I remembered reaching for my phone, a sudden, desperate urge to call Michael, to articulate this bizarre, creeping dread. My fingers hovered over his contact, but a strange, heavy inertia settled in my chest. What would I say? The shadows are whispering what I can't understand, but it feels important. The words felt absurd, impossible to voice, as if my own tongue were strangely bound from acknowledging the burgeoning reality, even to myself. A cold certainty solidified then. This wasn't just stress or fatigue. This was something else entirely, something that had begun to claim a quiet space within me, a space where unspeakable things now resided. It felt like a deep internal decision had already been made, one I had no control over, the choice to listen, or perhaps to be listened to. The air went cold the moment the first whisper breached the silence, not from a person, but from the deepening corner of my living room. I remember gripping the armrest, my breath catching, because even then I knew these weren't just shadows. They were the echoes of unspoken things, things I'd buried so deep they'd found another way out. The indistinct murmurs, once just a faint, impossible suggestion, began to coalesce. They evolved into a strange, resonant hum that pulsed with an unsettling rhythm, especially when the light bled from the sky and the city outside dimmed into a patchwork of artificial glows. It wasn't the sound of an appliance, nor the bass from a neighbor's stereo. This was internal, vibrating within the bones of my apartment, and more disturbingly, within my own skull. My mornings became a perpetual fog, a heavy blanket draped over my consciousness, blurring the edges of reality. Each night was a restless vigil, my body strung taut against the encroaching tide of these phantom conversations, listening to a chorus that spoke without uttering a single decipherable word. I tried, desperately, to articulate the burgeoning terror. One afternoon, I called Michael, hoping his grounded, logical mind could offer some explanation, some rational anchor to pull me back from this strange descent. I remember gripping the phone, the plastic warm against my ear, and forming the words, "Michael, something is wrong. I keep hearing," but the sentence died in my throat. My vocal cords felt like lead, my tongue a dry, unresponsive thing. I sputtered, coughed, and the silence on my end was so thick I could almost hear his polite, confused patience. "Eleanor, are you there? Everything all right?" He'd asked, his voice a distant, normal thing that only highlighted my profound alienation. I managed a strained, "Just tired, Michael, really tired," before ending the call, shame burning in my cheeks. Days later, when my sister Sarah insisted on stopping by, a knot of anxious hope tightened in my chest. Sarah, with her kind eyes and practical wisdom gleaned from her social work, usually knew how to untangle my thoughts. She sat across from me, sipping her tea, listening patiently as I tried again. "It's the quiet, Sarah," I started, my voice thin. "It's not quiet anymore. There are sounds, but not sounds exactly. More like whispers." I gestured vaguely towards the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed particularly dense, even in the afternoon light. Sarah frowned, her brow furrowing with concern, but the words wouldn't come, not the right words. I struggled, feeling the physical block, a strange constriction in my esophagus, as if an invisible hand were clamping down. Her gaze softened, morphing into that familiar, pitying stare that spoke volumes of what she thought was happening. Burnout, anxiety, perhaps something more clinical. "Eleanor, honey, maybe you need a break, a vacation," she offered gently, entirely missing the core of my dread. The unspoken truth festered, making my silence louder than any scream could be. The shadows, meanwhile, had begun to change. They were no longer merely areas of reduced light. They held substance, a quality of knowing. When I turned my back, I felt them deepen, shift, almost stretch towards me with an unnerving, predatory intent. I saw them in the periphery of my vision, a flicker against a wall, a sudden elongated stretch under a table, and a terrible conviction began to form. They knew. They knew the unspeakable truths I carried, buried deep beneath layers of conscious avoidance, truths I had never dared to voice, even to myself. And now they were articulating them, not with language, but with their eerie, wordless whispers, a relentless, unspoken chorus that echoed the very things I was terrified to confront or even identify. It was a torment that clawed at the edges of my sanity, a constant reminder of something profoundly wrong within me, mirrored by the creeping wrongness around me. There was no escape. The apartment, my mind, had become a prison. The silence I had once craved was now the loudest, most deafening thing, a cacophony of what I desperately refused to admit. I found myself waiting in the darkest hours for the next shift, the next resonant thrum, knowing it carried a message meant only for me, a secret I couldn't acknowledge but could no longer ignore. The weight of unsaid things, it seems, can conjure realities far more chilling than any overt threat. Eleanor struggled to vocalize the insidious hum, to name the dread she felt, resonates with a profound, almost universal fear of confronting our own hidden truths. What starts as a whisper in the periphery can become a deafening roar within, especially when those echoes are of what we ourselves refuse to acknowledge. It leaves you wondering, are the shadows truly whispering, or are they merely reflecting the silence we've created? As Eleanor grappled with the unspeakable, her silence became her loudest confession. Here on Content Channel, we delve into such unsettling journeys into the human psyche. What do you think Eleanor should have done when her words failed her? Should she have forced them out, or continued to internalize the creeping terror? Thank you for joining me in Eleanor's unsettling journey through the whispers. Join us again soon as we ponder whether Eleanor will ever break her silence, or if the shadows will finally speak her truth for her.